Nearly 2 years after he was murdered, the Associated Press has obtained the FBI files that detail the myriad threats to the life of Wichita doctor George Tiller in the years before an anti-abortion extremist finally killed him in 2009. According to the Associated Press, the documents mostly cover cases that were not prosecuted or cases where federal investigators couldn't identify suspects. They include claims in November 1996 that an anti-abortion activist told an inmate at a women's prison in Topeka that he planned to kill Tiller, a 1994 incident in which a grenade was left in a paper sack outside Tiller's clinic, a suspicious package made to look like a bomb in 1998, an anthrax hoax letter sent in 2002. Also, a woman with a history of threatening Dr. Tiller who told a nurse at a Wichita hospital in 2000 that she planned to finish the job on the doctor. We knew that Dr. Tiller's clinic was bombed in 1986. We knew that thousands of protesters converged on his clinic in 1991 to physically blockade its entrance. We knew that Dr. Tiller was shot in both arms in 1993. And of course, that he was murdered, gunned down in his church in 2009 by the anti-abortion extremist Scott Roeder. But now we know that when there wasn't actual violence in Dr. Tiller's life, there were threats of violence, and lots of them. Because apparently if you are a doctor and you want to provide this legal, supposedly constitutionally protected service to women in this country, this is the kind of life you're forced to have. A life of violence or threats of violence or both. Anti-abortion activists used to circulate wanted posters of Dr. Tiller. It's believed this one went around just before he was shot, the first time in 1993. We're told that these wanted posters targeting doctors in North Carolina started circulating there just after Dr. Tiller was murdered in 2009. One of the doctors featured in these posters told us he believed the poster was a call for his murder. We unfortunately have another wanted style poster to report on tonight. No one has been able to provide abortion services in Wichita since Dr. Tiller was murdered almost 2 years ago. But this woman, Dr. Mila Means, is trying. She's training to become an abortion provider. She's looking for a new office in Wichita. She has not actually started providing abortion services yet. But this poster targeting Dr. Means' office manager has already been circulating in the neighborhood where this woman lives. It has a picture, a home phone number, and a home address for the office manager. It instructs people to contact her and ask her to stop participating in the violent destruction of little baby boys and girls for $1. We've talked on the show before about the threats and intimidation Dr. Means herself is facing. One threat we specifically called out back in January was this letter, allegedly from an anti-abortion activist named Angel Dillard. It is addressed to Dr. Means. It reads in part, quote, "If Dr. Tiller could speak from hell, he would tell you what a soulless existence you're purposefully considering, all in the name of greed. Thousands of people are already looking into your background, not just in Wichita, but from all over the U.S. They will know your habits and routines. They know where you shop, who your friends are, what you drive, where you live. You will be checking under your car every day because maybe today is the day someone places an explosive under it. People will be picketing your home, your office. You will come under greater scrutiny than you've ever known, legally and professionally. We will not let this abomination continue without doing everything we can to stop it." Now the Justice Department has filed a lawsuit against the alleged author of that letter. The lawsuit is for writing that letter, charging that it was meant to intimidate Dr. Means. In the summer of 2009, just over a month after Dr. Tiller's murder, Angel Dillard, the alleged author of that letter, told the Associated Press that since Scott Roeder was arrested for killing Dr. Tiller, she and her husband have exchanged several letters with Mr. Roeder, and they have spoken to him by phone, and that she planned to visit him in jail. You may recall that after Shelley Shannon shot Dr. Tiller the first time in 1993, investigators dug up a booklet in her backyard, the Army of God Manual, a user's guide to bombing, burning, and vandalizing abortion clinics. The group calling itself Army of God believes that killing abortion providers is justifiable homicide. It promotes that idea. When Shelley Shannon went to prison for shooting Dr. Tiller and for other clinic attacks, Scott Roeder visited her in prison. According to our next guest's reporting, during those visits, Scott Roeder came to consider himself to be a member of this group, the Army of God. The Army of God published several editions of this manual, instructions on terrorizing abortion providers, exhortations to kill abortion providers. Members of the Army of God also signed on to a defensive action statement, defending people who had killed abortion providers and pledging themselves to the same tactics. The Army of God is out there. It is a group way, way, way on the violent fringes of the anti-abortion movement. Or at least it was. At the end of his term as Attorney General of the great state of Kansas, Republican Phil Kline appointed a special prosecutor to investigate Dr. George Tiller. The special prosecutor appointed by Mr. Kline was a man who had not just protested Dr. Tiller's clinic during the Summer of Mercy protests in 1991. According to our next guest's new book, for the 10th anniversary of those protests in 2001, he hosted at his home one of the Army of God guys who had signed that defensive action statement proclaiming that murdering abortion doctors was justified, and who called Shelley Shannon a hero for her 1993 attempted murder of Dr. Tiller. And suddenly law enforcement in the state of Kansas is 1 degree of separation from the fringiest of the fringe, the violent fringe. And that is how extremism is mainstreamed. We almost just had the entire federal government shut down over Republicans' crusade to defund Planned Parenthood.
Are you willing to hold up this entire budget over defunding Planned Parenthood?
Well, of course I am.
This weekend, would-be Republican presidential candidate Newt Gingrich spoke at an event at Liberty University where he was co-billed alongside a panel discussion called Abortion, Ending the Holocaust. This is the way you construct a national mainstream Republican candidacy now. You stand alongside abortion as the Holocaust events. You advocate shutting down the federal government rather than allowing funding for pap smears at Planned Parenthood. That's the Republican mainstream, and you want to be hardcore in your anti-abortion views? Where does the mainstream stop and the fringe begin anymore? Where's the line? Joining us now for the interview tonight is Steven Singular. He is author of the new book, The Wichita Divide, The Murder of Dr. George Tiller and the Battle Over Abortion. Mr. Singular, I've been looking forward to meeting you for a long time. Thank you for writing the book. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
You write about the fight over abortion in this country as not just a fight, not just a debate, but you describe it as a civil war. Why do you choose that term?
Well, I think that it's just entered so many lives and so many families. In this particular book, I took 2 families and wanted to show how that war had played out in the lives of the Tiller family and in the lives of the Scott Roeder family. And I didn't just want to write a diatribe about abortion, but I wanted to tell a story about it and how this kind of hateful rhetoric or this kind of demonization filters down into individual lives. Neither one of these men intended to be involved in this war or in any kind of combat like this. Dr. Tiller was going to be a dermatologist. That was his plan. But his father died in the early 1970s. And he took over his office after a while, and his women came in and told their stories that he learned that his father had been performing illegal abortions or abortions under the table with these women for many, many years. And they told him their stories, and they told him what a good doctor he was, and they told him how they needed this service and what a good thing it was to have in Wichita so women could be safe and healthy and in these procedures. And eventually it sunk into him, and he decided to follow in his father's footsteps. Roe v. Wade had already been passed. It was a legal service, and he took it over, and he provided this service for many, many women, and they were very grateful for it. When he was put on trial in 2009, about 2 months before he was killed, the state of Kansas tried to bring charges against him in what is called an inquisition. I think it's a wonderful word to use in the 21st century. I thought that was the 15th or 16th century, but we've brought it back into this time so they could, finally get him in court and try him and use due process. And the citizens of Wichita acquitted him of 19 charges in 25 minutes. And after it was over, they went to the judge and they said, "We would like to express an opinion to him or our feelings to him after the verdict," which is highly unusual in any criminal case. And they wrote a letter and said, "Thank you for doing this for the city of Wichita." Wow. And this is a man who'd been shot and bombed and everything else. So he had carried on this tradition and he had provided this service. So that's his story. That's one part of the book. He was sucked into this war. He never wanted to be demonized or targeted or hated or any of that. He just wanted to be a physician practicing his trade. Scott Roeder was going to be a salesman or work in that area, but he got connected with the anti-tax movement. That's how he was sucked into all this, and that eventually led to getting into anti-abortion groups and other groups, and he became more and more fanatical in that. So it's really the story of how these 2 families were trapped in this war.
One of the things that I found fascinating. I feel like I've read a lot about this story. We've done a lot of reporting about the show just as a show and a staff, but you're reporting specifically on where Scott Roeder sort of came from. And I think what you learned by covering so many other different types of extremists in your career as an author and a journalist was some of the most fascinating stuff. Do you mind if we take a quick break and we come back and talk about that stuff?
Sure.
Great. Stephen Singular is our guest. The book is called The Wichita Divide. It's really good. It comes out tomorrow. We'll be right back. In 1984, a man named Alan Berg, this man, he was a radio talk show host in Denver. He was Jewish. In 1984, he was murdered. He was shot in his driveway. Alan Berg's murder was planned and carried out by a neo-Nazi group called The Order. Our next guest wrote a book about that murder. For his trouble, his own life was threatened. The book about the assassination of Alan Berg by white supremacists was called Talk to Death. It was Stephen Singular's first book. His latest book, 25 years later, is about the assassination of Dr. George Tiller by the anti-abortion extremist Scott Roeder in 2009. Mr. Singular says he thinks of the book about Dr. Tiller's murder as a sequel of sorts to the book about Alan Berg's murder, saying in the book, quote, the overwhelming difference in the U.S. between 1984, when Alan Berg was shot in an act of domestic terrorism, and 2009 was that extremism was no longer extreme. The sense of victimization that had once fueled The Order was now broadcast 24 hours a day on talk radio, on cable television, and was encouraged in countless other respectable venues. Joining us now once again is Stephen Singular, author of the new book, The Wichita Divide, The Murder of Dr. George Tiller, and the Battle Over Abortion. Stephen, you talk a lot in this book about the mainstreaming of what used to be fringe ideas. Do you see parallels in the motivation of these different fringe figures who committed these two murders 25 years apart?
Well, there's no question about it. I mean, Scott Roeder was very familiar with the Turner Diaries, which was the novel that the Order used to carry out their 240 crimes that they committed in 1983 and 1984. This was a violently anti-Semitic fantasy novel that was sold at gun shows. Timothy McVeigh was involved in that as well. So there's a thread that runs through the whole story. The people that killed Berg were familiar with that. McVeigh was very familiar with it. He blew up a building, you know, at 9 o'clock in the morning, which was a scene in the novel. And then Roeder traveled in some of the same circles, and it was around, you know, the same literature. They also had this strange idea that Roeder did, that he was one of the actual Jews in the Old Testament. I mean, this is one of the most unusual ideas that runs through this whole mentality, that they are the actual chosen people of God, or the Jews of the Old Testament. The people who killed Berg felt that way. Roeder bought into that. And it's one of these strains that runs through the whole thing. And apparently, when you get to that level, you know, all you have to obey is God's law, not man's law. And that's always the rationalization for this kind of violence.
And that man's law is, in effect, obedience to man's law would actually be a sin, because it would be discounting your own divine inspiration and instruction, right?
Well, yeah, but more it is, I think that it just overrides the rule of law, which is one of the foundations of our society. So in the state of Kansas, you have someone like Phil Klein, who's the Attorney General, who's the highest elected official in the state, using the power of law to go after Dr. Tiller in every possible way he can. When this is a legal activity that's being carried out, he uses the resources of the state, he uses the people of the state, he takes women's medical records and hides them and scurries them around the state and does whatever he wants with them after a judge has told him that he cannot do that. He's bending the law, and that's the point of the whole book. With the Order, you have 9 guys out in the woods who are fanatic and pretty obviously crazy and have no level of success in our society. Now you have the head legal official in Kansas going after people in a similar way. I mean, the demonization, the hatred, the whole thing, it's gone from the fringes into the mainstream. And there are consequences for that, because while those people are not violent themselves, that stuff filters down. And the other parallel in the Berg case and the Tiller case is that it affects people who are not emotionally stable. We see this over and over again. The guy who killed Berg was not emotionally stable. Scott Roeder was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager. The guy who shoots Gabriel Giffords, the same thing. So you need to have a sense of responsibility when you're doing this kind of demonization. When you're saying Tiller the killer over and over again, you're not just saying it, you know, to people who might be somewhat stable. You're saying it to a lot of other people, and that filters down, and that has consequences.
Is it substantively important that the Justice Department has apparently opened an investigation into whether or not Scott Roeder acted alone.
I think it's extremely important. They tried to do this in the 80s. People wanted them to carry out an investigation when clinics were being bombed and the clinic was being bombed. They didn't want to do it. They talked about it in the 90s. They didn't want to do it. And finally now there is a grand jury in Kansas City saying, what are the connections? Who financed Roeder? Were there other sources of revenue that were supporting him? We know he was involved financially with Operation Rescue. But after these events happen, people always say, no, we didn't know who he was. We don't know anything about it. That's simply not true. It's factually untrue. The federal government needs to look into that to see what the roots and branches are and to see if other people should be indicted.
Stephen Singular is author of the book, The Wichita Divide, The Murder of Dr. George Tiller and the Battle Over Abortion. The book comes out tomorrow. I really appreciate you being here the night before it's released. And I have to say, just as somebody who's done a lot of reporting on this, you both deepened and really widened the scope of what we know about this murder in a way that I think is going to be really helpful to understanding its impact. So I think it's a real service to the country. Thanks for having done it.
Thank you.